In a world where silence is often regarded as a safe shield, the death of Yu Menglong poses an unavoidable paradox. When a life that once existed vividly before the public eye suddenly vanishes, the terrifying element lies not only in the loss itself, but in the prolonged information gap that follows. Is it possible that, in the complex power struggle of the entertainment industry, silence is no longer neutral, but has become an intentional move? And the aura that once surrounded a human being, is it true glory, or merely a layer of light covering a tomb built of pressure, contracts, and belated empathy? 100 days have passed since Yu Menglong departed from this world. Historically speaking, it's a brief period, almost insignificant. Yet, for those still trying to understand what transpired, those 100 days carry the weight of waiting, of questioning, and of an unease that is yet to be soothed. Death in itself is an inevitable part of human life. What prevents the public from finding peace is the fact that this departure is shrouded in a faint mist, where fundamental questions have yet to find satisfactory explanations. There are those who admit that, before this story unfolded, they were accustomed to a state of indifference. Life continued with its familiar rhythm, and the seemingly distant issues of celebrities rarely touched personal emotions. However, the event concerning Yu Menglong created a silent shockwave. It forced many to pause, to open their eyes to the dark corners that have always existed but were often ignored. When a story remains unclarified, silence is no longer a harmless choice. It gradually becomes a psychological burden spreading through society. In cyberspace, a symbolic image has been circulated over the past few days. Countless tiny hands together supporting and pushing a soul forward. Someone once sarcastically remarked that even if hundreds of millions of tiny individuals joined together, they would still lack the strength to create any significant change. Yet, that very image poses another, deeper question. Is the value of an individual measured by solitary strength, or by the ability to raise a collective voice when facing injustice and informational voids? The concern for Yu Menglong, therefore, is not merely a momentary curiosity about a famous person. It reflects a deeper need, the need to understand, to know, and to trust. If today a story can be closed with information that is insufficient to be convincing, then tomorrow what will happen when similar situations befall ordinary people without spotlights or public attention? It is from that question that the journey to find the meaning of silence and the responsibility of collective memory begins. Before the name Yu Menglong appeared densely in public discussions, he was known as a relatively quiet face in the Chinese language entertainment industry. His career path did not bear the marks of a loud star or one who frequently faced controversy. On the contrary, the familiar image was that of an actor who worked steadily, spoke little, and rarely took the initiative to step into the center of the media. This very reticence, in an environment accustomed to fierce competition and unspoken rules that are difficult to name, became the anchor for the public to begin questioning the broader context surrounding the story. The mainland entertainment industry has long been more than just a space for artistic creation. It is a complex ecosystem where power, economic interests, and public image are tightly intertwined. In this system, success is measured not only by roles or recognition, but also by the ability to adapt to invisible limits. There are rules that are not written down, but exist as self-evident. There are boundaries that are not announced, but deeply govern personal choices. For those operating inside, silence is sometimes viewed as a safety strategy, a way to maintain balance in a high-pressure environment. According to information recalled later, Yu Menglong once entered a phase of his career marked by many changes. The surface of these changes could be interpreted using the familiar language of the industry: roles, contracts, image orientation. However, behind decisions that seem purely professional was a context where the boundary between individual freedom and systemic compliance was not always clear. At this intersection, questions about motives began to arise in the public mind. Public motives are often presented through easily acceptable concepts: career development, contractual responsibilities, market demands. These motives are not abnormal. They reflect the familiar operational logic of a large-scale entertainment industry. However, alongside them, there always exist latent motives that are harder to define. Prolonged psychological pressure, the fear of isolation, the sense of losing control over one's own life, all are factors that are not easily measured but possess a profound influence on personal experience. When the incident occurred, the initial information was released quickly, closing the story with a brief conclusion. Procedurally, this is not uncommon. Yet, for many observers, that presentation revealed notable gaps. Fundamental questions regarding the circumstances, the sequence of events, and the chain of related evidence were not clarified in detail. This absence does not automatically equate to wrongdoing, but in a society accustomed to strict information control, it quickly became a catalyst for suspicion. This is where the concept of information gaps begins to be mentioned. Information gaps are not just technical issues of the media, they are psychological issues of society. When data is insufficient to assemble a complete picture, the public tends to turn back the clock, searching for details once considered unremarkable. Old statements, old images, even past silences, all are placed into a new context, where each fragmented piece is expected to partially fill the unfinished narrative. This process does not merely reflect the desire to seek the truth about an individual. It shows a collective psychology attempting to protect itself against a sense of insecurity. When an incident involving a celebrity can be closed with unconvincing information, a deeper anxiety begins to form. If tomorrow a similar situation occurs with ordinary people without spotlights or public attention, to what extent will they be protected? At a deeper level, the story touches upon a core issue of modern society: who controls information and to what degree? In a system where power and data are not distributed equally, transparency is not only a moral value, but also a condition for maintaining public trust. When that trust is eroded over time, every information gap can become fertile ground for speculation, even if that speculation is not necessarily based on verified evidence. Notably, public skepticism in this stage does not necessarily stem from a desire to deny all announced information. Instead, it reflects a state of mental defense. Asking questions becomes a natural reflex when people feel they lack full access to the truth. In these circumstances, silence is no longer perceived as neutral. It carries the added meaning of delay or even evasion. Viewed from this perspective, the story of Yu Menglong cannot be understood merely as a personal incident. It is the product of a complex operational structure where personal decisions are enveloped by greater pressures and where the information announced may not be enough to reassure society. It is the intersection of public motives, latent motives, and these information gaps that created the foundation for the powerful wave of reaction in the following days. From that foundation, the story began to move beyond the scope of contextual analysis to enter a different phase. A phase where social media did not merely reflect public opinion, but actively restructured the narrative with a speed and intensity far exceeding initial predictions. When the information gaps were not yet filled, the story quickly moved beyond the scope of an individual event and became the center of a media flood. In a short amount of time, the digital space moved at a frantic pace. Platforms once familiar with entertainment discussions were suddenly flooded with serious questions, reflecting a significant change in public psychology. Every new piece of information, however small, had the capacity to stir collective emotions and trigger a series of different interpretations. The initial public reaction bore the hallmarks of sharing and grief. People mentioned remaining images, past roles that made an impression, and an indefinable sense of loss. However, that stream of emotion did not exist independently. Very soon after, it blended with suspicion. When official announcements were made without accompanying details sufficient to answer basic questions, the public began to self-organize a process of searching for their own answers. Social media, from merely reflecting events, became a space for restructuring the narrative. In that context, symbolic actions appeared with increasing frequency. Online memorial campaigns, calls for signatures, and the placement of images and messages related to the case in overseas public spaces showed a level of dissemination that transcended national borders. Notably, this concern did not only come from those who follow the entertainment industry. It attracted communities that were otherwise less directly involved, but were sensitive to issues of justice, transparency, and the right to know. The story, therefore, touched upon the more universal concerns of modern society. Parallel to that dissemination was a distinct process of polarization in public opinion. A segment of the public chose to trust the announced information. For them, continuing to dig deeper might only increase tension and unnecessary speculation. This view stems from a desire to maintain social order, where official conclusions are seen as a necessary stopping point, even if not every detail is made public. Conversely, another group argued that it was precisely the absence of full information that caused suspicion to spread. For them, asking questions did not equate to denial, but was the minimum requirement to protect public trust. These two streams of perspective coexisted and sometimes clashed directly in prolonged debates. Those exchanges did not only revolve around an individual, but expanded to how society reacts to announcements of an authoritative nature. Social media, in this context, acted both as a tool for connection and a space for magnifying conflict. Every article, every video, every comment could be interpreted in many different ways, depending on the experience and position of the recipient. Another factor contributing to the increased intensity of the media flood was the participation of influential individuals. When voices not directly related to the event spoke out, the story was placed in a broader frame of reference. Some approached the issue from the perspective of social ethics, emphasizing accountability and the necessity of transparency. Others analysed it as a quintessential example of a media crisis in an information-controlled environment. Despite the different approaches, the commonality was that this event became a catalyst for a discussion far exceeding the scope of entertainment. The impact of the media flood did not stop at public opinion. It also affected how the public viewed the entire cultural and entertainment ecosystem. Questions about power, about the safety of individuals within the system, and about the boundary between private life and collective interest were recalled with increasing frequency. This concern reflects a societal state where trust is no longer a given, but needs to be reinforced by clear and consistent information. In that divided context, emotions strongly governed how people received information. There were moments when outrage overwhelmed reason, causing unverified hypotheses to spread rapidly. Simultaneously, there were also efforts calling for restraint, emphasizing the importance of distinguishing between facts and speculation. This tug-of-war created a tense atmosphere where each side believed they were protecting a core value, even if those values were understood in different ways. It was during this phase that the story posed a question that is not easy to answer. When information is incomplete, to whom does the responsibility for seeking the truth belong, and where is the limit of skepticism? This is no longer the issue of a single case, but a collective challenge for society in the digital media era, where the speed of dissemination often far outpaces the ability to verify. Faced with this increasingly clear polarization, many began to question their own position in that flow. Some chose silence, some continued to speak out, and some changed their views when accessing new information. The diversity in reactions showed that the media flood was not just a surface phenomenon, but an expression of deep-seated contradictions in how society handles issues related to power and trust. And it was from this polarization, debate, and skepticism that the story gradually moved toward another stage. A darker stage, where unanswered suspicions no longer merely caused concern, but began to profoundly impact society's sense of safety and how people view their own future. When the wave of discussion had spread and the streams of perspective were clearly revealed, the story entered its darkest phase. This was no longer the time for spontaneous reactions or isolated debates. The absence of information, stretching day by day, began to leave a deeper mark on the collective perception of society. Unanswered questions accumulated over time, creating a state of simmering tension where trust became fragile and vulnerable. At this stage, public opinion no longer focused on individual details, but turned its attention to the overall picture. Signs previously considered fragmented were placed side by side, not to assert a specific scenario, but to point out that information gaps still persisted. Those information gaps, although they could not yet be filled with verified data, carried significant psychological weight. They caused the public not only to wonder what had happened, but also to fear how similar incidents might be handled in the future. A sense of helplessness appeared increasingly clearly in exchanges. There were those who admitted they no longer expected new information to arrive soon, yet they still could not accept silence as a final conclusion. In that context, skepticism no longer bore a confrontational nuance. It gradually became a mental self-defense mechanism. When unable to access the full truth, humans seek to protect themselves by asking questions, even while understanding that those questions may never be answered completely. The climax of this dark phase lay in the story transcending the scope of an individual to become a mirror reflecting collective anxiety. Many began to compare this case with other events that occurred in the past, where official announcements were made quickly but lacked a detailed explanatory process. The repetition of that pattern, even in different contexts, caused the sense of unease to gradually become a familiar state. When the abnormal repeats enough times, society faces the risk of accepting it as an inevitable part of life. However, exactly at that dark point, a subtle transformation began to take shape. Instead of revolving only around suspicions regarding a specific person, the discussion gradually shifted toward the question of collective responsibility. If an unclarified story could cause such a widespread and prolonged effect, what did that say about the relationship between citizens, media, and power? This question did not aim to find an object to hold accountable, but to clarify the role of each component in maintaining social trust. The moment regarded as an enlightenment did not come from new information or a decisive piece of evidence. It came from the realization that, regardless of the outcome of the case, its impact had far exceeded its original scope. The central character of the story was no longer mentioned merely as an actor or a name associated with controversy. He became a symbol for the anxiety over the fragility of the individual before larger structures where a personal voice is easily drowned out without public attention. From this perspective, many began to look back at their own roles. Not everyone has the ability to create enough pressure to drive transparency or change the way the system operates. However, the choice not to turn away, not to hurriedly forget, was seen as a form of silent participation. In a society where information can be limited, collective memory becomes a different form of archive, harder to control and harder to erase. That enlightenment carried with it an important realization. This story is not just about the past, it also poses questions for the future. If today a case can leave so many gaps, then what will ensure that similar stories in the coming years will be handled differently? That question has no simple answer, but the fact that it was raised showed a change in how society views the right to know and the right to ask. At the end of this stage, the dominant emotion was no longer outrage or bewilderment, but a sobriety mixed with caution. Public opinion seemed to realize that the search for truth is a long process requiring patience and the ability to distinguish clearly between desires and facts. Instead of chasing every new hypothesis, many began to emphasize the importance of keeping the discussion from sliding into extremism so that the very need for transparency is not lost in the wave of emotion. It was from the intersection of darkness and that awakening that the story moved into the final chapter. A chapter not aimed at closing the case with a conclusion, but at looking back at what had happened, drawing out long-term meaning and reflecting on its impact on society. And that was also when the echo of the story continued to resonate, not as a verdict, but as an open question for everyone. When the darkness of the contracts, invisible pressures, and prolonged silence enveloped the name Yu Menglong, what remained was not a final sentence, but a persistent echo in the minds of those left behind. That echo was not noisy. It did not take the form of slogans or accusations. It existed as a hanging question, a reminder that there are stories which, although formally closed, cannot yet truly end in social consciousness. This case, in the final analysis, is not just the story of an individual or an industry. It reflects a broader reality of how modern society faces power, information, and trust. When transparency is replaced by ambiguous voids, public trust does not vanish immediately. It is eroded bit by bit through a sense of unease, through unanswered questions, and through the gradual normalization of accepting the unclear as an ordinary part of life. Notably, throughout that journey, the need to ask questions did not necessarily imply antagonism. For many, it was simply a way to protect their own capacity for judgment. Not hurriedly forgetting an unclarified story was seen as an act of caution rather than a political or moral statement. In that context, collective memory becomes a special storage space where what has not been fully explained is still held, waiting for more suitable conditions to be recognized. The story of Yu Menglong, therefore, does not provide a clear answer regarding right or wrong. Instead, it poses a cautionary lesson. If today an event can leave so many gaps and still pass with time, then tomorrow, what will ensure that similar cases do not repeat? This question does not aim to sow doubt, but to emphasize the importance of transparency as the foundation of social trust. At this ending point, the dominant emotion is no longer mere outrage or grief. It is a silent awakening. An awakening that observing, remembering, and questioning in a sober manner is the small but necessary responsibility of each individual. In a world where information can be limited or shaped, the refusal to forget becomes a choice with long-term significance. The future remains open, and perhaps the final pieces of this story will never be fully filled. However, its impact has transcended the scope of a personal event. It forced society to look directly into the most sensitive corners of the relationship between power and truth. And it is there that the story ends, not with a period, but with a question mark for all. Will we choose silence to find temporary peace, or continue to keep those memories and questions from being swept away by time?